If you learned the Old West from the movies, here's the first myth to let go of: the cool cowboy cigarette. One hand striking a match, the other steady on the reins, smoke curling like a personal signature. It looks effortless. It looks self-assured. And it didn't belong to most working cowboys the way Hollywood taught you to believe. Hold that image for one more second, then walk with me through the door of a real saloon. Not a movie set, but the kind built for men who spent their days in dust, wind, and heat, and their nights hunting for a chair that didn't wobble. The first thing that hits you isn't music. It isn't laughter. It's the air. Not a tidy ribbon of smoke. Not the familiar packaged scent we associate with modern cigarettes. This air is thick and crowded, heavy enough to feel. Cigar smoke hangs low and stubborn, because cigars were common and they burned slow. Pipe smoke settles into corners. Lanterns add their sharp, oily edge. The room is warm from bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. Coats, wool, sweat. There's the sour tang of damp leather. Old spilled beer. Whiskey breathed out 100 times. And then there's a smell from the corner you can't quite name at first. Something smoldering without flame. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just unpleasant. A quiet reminder that this isn't a space dressed for a close-up. It's a working room, meant to be used hard and cleaned quickly, if it gets cleaned at all. Movies taught us to expect style. The West, in reality, demanded endurance. Even the idea that every cowboy had a cigarette ready to flick between his lips is a modern layer laid over the past. For much of the 19th century, cigarettes in the United States were often hand-rolled and far from cheap or common, and price and availability shape habits more reliably than legends ever do. The real shift came later, when machines made cigarettes faster, cheaper, and abundant, and the market exploded in the 1880s. Before that wave, the everyman cigarette simply wasn't the default out on the range. Hollywood also smooths over another detail: the social meaning of cigarettes themselves. In some American circles of the late 19th century, cigarettes weren't considered rugged at all. They were seen as fashionable, urban, sometimes even described as feminine when compared to cigars and pipes. That doesn't mean no one smoked them. It means the cigarette wasn't automatically a badge of frontier toughness, the way film later framed it. So when you picture the classic cowboy in a smoky saloon, adjust the frame. Think less about a glamorous prop and more about what rooms like this actually did, absorbing everything people carried in on their clothes and in their lungs. The West wasn't built on clean lines or iconic poses. It was built on long days, rough nights, and the smell of that reality filling the room without asking permission. That moment of disappointment, when the myth cracks, that's part of the story. Because once you stop chasing the movie version, you can finally see the real one. Not prettier, not cooler, just honest. And honesty, in a room like this, comes with a sting in the nose and a taste you can't pretend is anything else. A working cowboy doesn't reach into his pocket for a neat little paper tube the way the movies trained us to expect. Out on the range, when the day finally loosens its grip, what you're more likely to see is a pipe pulled from a bedroll, or a short, rough cigar passed from hand to hand. It's practical. It's durable. It can survive wind, dust, and getting tossed into a saddlebag without turning into useless crumbs. I picture it in the dim after sundown. A man sits with his back against a wagon wheel. His hands aren't clean. Nothing about the job keeps them clean for long. He pinches tobacco, packs the bowl, and lights it from a coal or a match. Not to look good, not to make a point, just because it's one small habit that fits inside a life with very little room for comfort. Here's what the legend skips. For much of the 19th century in the United States, cigarettes were often made by hand. Factory output existed, but it wasn't yet the cheap, flood-the-market product it would become. Large-scale machine production took off after James Bonsack developed a cigarette rolling machine in 1880 and patented it in 1881. And companies like James B. Duke's used that kind of machinery to drive costs down and output up. Before that shift, a ready-made cigarette could be more of a city purchase, more convenience than daily tool, something you bought, not something you depended on out on the range. So what did many working men choose instead? The things that suited the world they lived in. Slower, sturdier, easier to carry. Pipes and cigars made sense. A pipe could be refilled again and again. A cigar didn't rely on paper, and it didn't crush as easily. And not every cigar was fancy, far from it. A lot of what people called cigars in the West were cheap and roughly made, and the language gives that away. Stogie became slang for a cigar, often the inexpensive kind. Source: cigar aficionado. Another name that shows up in the history is the cheroot, a thin cigar, open at both ends, often made cheaply. It's not hard to see why that shape mattered. Less fuss, less waste, more smoke for the money. Source: Encyclopedia Britannica. Now think about what that meant in a saloon or a bunkhouse. The smoke wasn't smooth. The tobacco wasn't carefully selected and blended for taste the way modern marketing likes to pretend it always was. Quality varied wildly, and plenty of it was low-grade. Some of it was harsh, some of it was sharp. Smoke that clung to wool and hair and didn't politely disappear the moment you stepped outside. That's the real twist. In the movies, smoking is a style choice. In the working West, it often looks more like a trade. You trade a few coins for something you can tolerate. You trade clean air for a habit that gives your hands something to do. You trade the taste in your mouth for a short break in your head. When I read old accounts of frontier life, the details that stay with me are rarely about looking cool. They're about getting by. Tobacco use in America didn't begin with cigarettes as the center of gravity. For a long time, the weight sat on chewing tobacco, snuff, cigars, and pipes. And only later did cigarettes become the dominant product for huge numbers of users. Source: nationalacademies.org. So if you're still holding on to that movie image, the cowboy and the cigarette, set it down for a moment. Replace it with what the work actually supports: a pipe bowl, a short rough cigar, and smoke that isn't a fashion statement. It's just something a person puts up with. Listen for the sound that never makes it into the movie version of the Old West. Not the piano, not the boots, not the laugh at the card table. It's the soft, wet tap of a man aiming at a metal pot near the bar. Chewing tobacco was everywhere in 19th century America, and once it became a habit, public places had to adapt. That's why spittoons showed up wherever men gathered: saloons, hotels, general stores, even rail cars and stations. They weren't decoration. They were basic equipment, as common as a water bucket. Now hold that in your mind and look at the room again. The floor isn't clean, polished wood. More often, it's covered with sawdust. Some places used it to soak up spilled beer and whiskey, and historical accounts mention another blunt reason. Chewing tobacco made a mess, and sawdust helped keep the floor from turning slick. Source: restauranting through history. And the smell isn't just smoke. Smoke is only one layer. Chewing tobacco makes the mouth flood with saliva. In a crowded saloon, multiply that by dozens of men. The spittoons catch some of it, but not all. Not everyone hits the target. Not everyone even tries. The sawdust darkens in patches. Boots grind it in, push it around, track it from one end of the room to the other. It clings to soles and drifts across the floor like sand at the edge of a tide. If you want a clean line for what the air was like, it's this: you weren't just breathing smoke. You were breathing a room where spit was part of the routine. Why chew at all? Historians point to practical reasons. It was common, easy to carry, and it fit a life where hands stayed busy and breaks were short. On cattle drives and in dusty towns, some people also claimed it helped with a dry mouth. I can't tell you every cowboy did it for that reason. There was never one rule for everyone. but the pattern shows up again and again in descriptions of the era. Chewing was everywhere. Even the spittoon itself tells you how normal it was. Many were made heavy and low, with a wide opening, because they had to survive being kicked and still do their job. The goal wasn't elegance. The goal was keeping as much of the mess off the floor as possible. Source: Union Pacific Railroad Museum. Halfway through thinking about all this, I always get hit by a memory that doesn't belong to the Old West at all. I'm a kid again, in a place where adults cared about manners. I remember being told, plainly, that shared spaces belong to everybody. You don't spread your habits onto other people. You clean up after yourself. You show respect, even when nobody's watching. Then I go back to the saloon in my mind, and the picture sharpens. Because the spittoon isn't just a container. It's a test of how much a person cares about the people around him. Some aim carefully. Some don't. And that choice matters when the room is packed. The floor is covered in sawdust, and the air is already thick. It's a small moral decision repeated 100 times a night. Do I treat this place like a shared room, or like it belongs to me? That's the turn the movies don't give you. They sell tobacco as a cool habit. They don't linger on what it costs everyone else in the room. So the next time you picture that classic Western saloon, change one detail. Don't focus on the smoke curling up toward the ceiling. Focus on the spittoons along the wall and near the bar, placed there because the mess was expected. And now the legend feels different, doesn't it? Not stylish, not clean. Just crowded air, sawdust underfoot, and a room full of people learning, by choice or by habit, what they were willing to breathe. The back door of a frontier saloon is where the story gets quieter and a lot more honest. Out front, you see the bar, the cards, the smoke. Out back, you find the parts that never made it into the movie script. Side rooms, dim hallways, a clerk's counter, and a shelf of bottles that promise relief in careful handwriting. In many Western towns, especially boom towns built around mines and rail lines, people weren't only chasing a drink or a smoke. They were chasing anything that could take the edge off a hard day. Historical accounts from places like Bravado, California, describe Chinatowns that included businesses and social spaces alongside opium smoking rooms, sometimes near saloons and gambling spots. That wasn't every town, and it wasn't everyone. But it happened often enough to be recorded in local reporting and official histories of the period. I want to say this plainly, because it matters. For most people, what they used wasn't a style choice. It was a coping tool in a place where comfort was scarce. Medical care could be limited, and loneliness had room to spread out. And opium in 19th century America didn't exist in just one form. There were smoking rooms in some cities and mining towns, but there was also something even more common, something that came in a bottle and was sold as medicine. Laudanum was opium dissolved in alcohol. Through the 19th century and into the early 20th, it was widely sold in the United States for pain, coughs, and stomach problems. It appeared in many patent medicines, marketed with sweeping promises and often vague labeling. Only later did federal rules begin to force clearer labels and tighter control, first with the Pure Food and Drugs Act in 1906, and later with the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act in 1914. Those dates matter because they show how ordinary these bottles once were in everyday life. Now imagine what that changes about the saloon myth. Movies fixate on smoke in the air. But some of what altered a person's mood didn't come from smoke at all. It came in drops, measured, swallowed, poured from a bottle that could sit right beside the whiskey. Which brings us to the drink itself. Frontier whiskey had a reputation for being rough, and not always because it was strong. In remote places, supply chains were shaky, and profit tempted people to cut corners. Some saloons served whiskey that was stretched, blended, or colored to pass for something better. Historians and period writing describe rectified spirits, neutral alcohol mixed with flavorings and coloring to imitate aged whiskey. Accounts of bad frontier liquor mention additives used to fake color and bite like burnt sugar, and in some stories, even tobacco. Here's what hits hardest. In that world, you could walk in thinking the choices were simple: smoke or don't, drink or don't, careful or careless. But the truth could be murkier. You might not fully know what was in the glass. You might not fully know what was in the bottle labeled medicine. The danger wasn't only the obvious things in the room. It was the hidden shortcuts people took when money was tight and rules were loose. So when someone says the Old West was simple, I think of that back hallway. The bright myth is out front. The real story lives behind the door. Bottles that blur the line between treatment and escape, and drinks that weren't always what they claimed to be. In some towns, the smoke wasn't the whole problem. Sometimes the smoke was something people swallowed. What was improved? I tightened the narrative flow, made the tone more natural and cinematic, and clarified the historical points while keeping your original edge and emotion. In the corner booth, under a lamp that throws more shadow than light, a well-dressed man opens a small case like it matters. Inside are cigars, tight-wrapped, kept dry, handled with care. He doesn't offer them to everyone. He offers them to the people he wants close. The gesture is quiet, but the message lands hard. This is who I am, and this is where I stand. A few feet away, the working hands are doing something else entirely. One man knocks the ash from his pipe against his boot heel. Another digs into a pouch of loose tobacco that looks like it survived rain, dust, and a long ride. Someone else rolls his own with paper so thin it tears if you rush. Nobody calls it style. It's just what they've got. That's what we miss when we picture the West as one big shared identity. The frontier had rules, and one of the clearest was social. What you smoked and how you smoked it could signal money, status, and power. Cigars carried weight in 19th century America. They were tied to public mail spaces and to business and politics. Not every cigar was expensive, but the good ones were. Imported cigars, especially those associated with Cuba, were often treated as luxury. In a town where most people wore the same dust and sweat, a fine cigar stood out. It said you had cash, connections, and the time to enjoy them. Pipes told a different story. A pipe could last for years. You could carry it, drop it, and light it again. It was practical, and it fit a life where you didn't want to keep paying for finished products. Corncob pipes became especially well known in the United States in the late 1800s because they were cheap and common. No one had to pretend they were fancy. They worked. And then there were the pouches. If you've ever seen old photos or old ads, you've probably noticed certain brand names that kept turning up. Bull Durham smoking tobacco is one of the famous ones, tied to Durham, North Carolina, and heavily advertised in the late 19th century. Whether a cowboy used that exact brand or a local cut, the point stays the same. Loose tobacco was a working person's format. It could be shared, it could be rationed, it could be stretched. Now put cigarettes into that picture, and you can see why they drew comments and side-eye in some places. For much of the 19th century in the United States, cigarettes didn't carry the tough image movies later gave them. They read as town, not range. Some period sources and later historians note that in certain circles, cigarettes were viewed as unmanly, especially compared to cigars, until late in the century. It wasn't universal, but it was common enough to shape reputations. And reputation mattered in the West. A cowboy didn't only want to be good at his job, he wanted to be seen the right way by the men around him. In a world where respect could mean work, protection, or a place at the table, people watched for signals. The wrong signal could cost you. Then the world shifted. Machine-made cigarettes became cheaper and more available in the 1880s, and mass marketing did the rest. What used to be linked to towns and city habits began to spread wider, but change doesn't erase old ideas overnight. Social habits hang on. People hang on. A ranch owner could still show his place in the world by pulling out a better cigar. A working cowboy could still show his by packing a pipe and carrying loose tobacco. So when you hear someone talk about cowboy style, remember what the real code looked like. It wasn't just hats and boots. It was the small choices that told everyone who had money, who had power, and who had to count every dime. And here's what stays with me. The myth makes everyone look the same, like the West was one big team. The truth is harder and more human. Even in a place famous for freedom, people still lived on a ladder. If this changed how you see that old movie image, pass it on. And if you want more true stories that strip the gloss off American legends, subscribe and share. Because the real West is still waiting behind the myth. What was improved? I smoothed the rhythm, sharpened the contrasts between classes, and made the voice feel more cinematic and native without changing your meaning.